welcome back to Wood Turning Lessons. This is number 13 in our series. And today I'm going to cover one of those areas that is very interesting to some people and others say, okay, thank you. I'm going to cover pen turning. So I'm going to take you through two different pens. One is the very basic pen that we turn first. It's very forgiving, and I'll show you the steps to do pen turning in general with that kit. And then we'll reset, and I'm going to do a second pen that is a little bit more demanding from the standpoint that all components are not quite the same. So let me show you where we're going to get started. I have here laid on this board in front of the lathe what we're going to do. This is called a 7mm pen, and it's pretty standard. Here's all the components you need for it. There's two brass tubes that go inside the blank. I lay them out like that so I know where to cut the blanks. And when we assemble it, there's a tip that goes here. And this is called a transmission. This is what makes the pen go up and down. It gets shoved into there. Then there's a clip assembly that go on the top, and lastly a little decorative band. And what we end up with is something that looks like this. Standard, what we call 7mm pen. So let me set the components aside and begin to take you through some of the steps we have to go through. I'm going to put all the parts back in the bag so I don't lose them, with the exception of the two brass tubes. I'll just set this aside. I need the brass tubes to lay out where to cut my wood blank. Most pen blanks are 3/4 square by 5 inches long. And if you just have some scrap wood and you want to prepare them to be pen blanks for later on, go to the bandsaw or table saw, cut them 3/4 square, 5 inches long, and it covers 90% of all the pen kits that you could possibly need. So I laid them out. It's going to be cut like this. I put a mark across here where I'm going to cut so that if I drop these components, I can get them back into right grain alignment order. And this part is throwaway. So I've been to the bandsaw. So here we are. This part here I don't need anymore. And the next step I'm going to do is I have to put a hole through these. But before I start anything on the lathe, let me set this all aside for a second and prepare the lathe. Okay, I've put the board aside, brought the tool rest over here because the first thing I need to address is the tool rest. In pen turning, because you're dealing with small things and things that you're going to touch a lot, it's important that you cut as smoothly as possible. And the first thing I need to do is take all the dinks and bangs and so on out of this tool rest. So, small file, step one is to file this tool rest. Most of the ones that come with your lathe tool rests are made of cast iron, which means it's fairly soft. And so every time you get a catch or a bang, you put a dent in the tool rest. As you're cutting, tool drops into those things and it transfers right to the surface of the wood. So I file this out, get it as smooth as I can. As you can see, I brought my own tool rest again because I happen to like it. It's about the right length for this project. Once I've got it filed, I went in the supply room and just grabbed a can of wax. A little wax on here also is going to help the tool slide smoothly. So I prepped. That is setting up. I'd like to be sure that the ways of the lathe are clean and things move easily and so on. I'm ready to go to work. So next thing I'm going to do is to take my components. Remember, we cut these. And now I have to put a hole through here to accommodate that brass tube. Next step is to do that. Before I start on any of these steps, I need to let you know that there's dozens and dozens of ways to do each of these activities. I'm just simply showing you the way I choose to do it at home. In the classroom, we do very similar techniques, but somewhat modified from the way I do it. So I'm going to try to do everything right here at the lathe rather than running to different parts of the campus here and doing different things. So I'm going to drill from the center section toward the end on this blank, and then from the center section toward the end on this blank. The idea is, as I push the drill bit through, if there's any blowout, it's going to happen on the waste side of the wood, which I can clean up later. This side right here, which is where the wood goes together for the kit, I want to keep as clean as possible. So my drilling is going to be this direction on both components. So to drill, I'm using my 4-jaw chuck. It just happens to be the way I do it. There are other ways. And I have what I call number 1 jaws, long jaws on here, and this will hold this blank square. I don't have to make it real tight. So that's in here. I'm going to get my tool rest out of the way. I'm going to bring my tailstock up. And now I'm going to insert a Jacobs chuck, which is on a Morris taper. And I drill in 2 steps. I use a spotting bit first to start my hole. And I follow up with the drill bit recommended by the kit. Now, each kit that you can purchase at a store comes with a set of instructions. Instructions say what size hole, what size drill bit. And I'll talk about bushings in a second, the things that establish the dimensions for the kit. They vary from kit to kit. And the instruction sheet you need to get, because assembly sometimes is not as simple as this particular kit's going to be. So, I'm going to set this aside for a second. Spotting bit just gets me started with a small hole. So my speed ought to be around 500. I don't want to go so fast that I burn the wood. So the idea is simply to come up close, lock the tailstock off, and using the quill, I'm just going to start a hole. And that's all I need to do with this. This gets the drill bit so that it runs true to the center of the wood. So I take this out, it's done. And I'm going to put my 7mm drill bit in. Lock it tight, bring up the tailstock, lock it in place. And now I'm going to drill all the way through. And I'm going to go a little bit, back it off, clear the chips. And this is tedious, I understand, but it's the best guarantee of drilling a straight square hole. Yeah, sorry about the sound. Now, I'm about halfway through. And what I can do, because the hole has already centered itself, I can loosen the tailstock, because this lathe runs very true, and simply slide the whole assembly in and out. Clearing, cutting, clearing, and through. Let's see what we did. So here's where we started. Here's where we ended up. Pretty well centered. I didn't find any blowout of the wood, any tearing of the fibers, which could have happened. So when I glue the brass tube in here, I won't have a lot of cleanup needed to be done. So that is one component. I've got to do it again on the other one. So I'll be back as soon as I drill the second hole. So here we are back. Pieces are drilled. The next thing I need to do is to insert the brass tubes. So let's talk about these brass tubes. They are pretty slippery, and so it's important that we rough this surface up, create some what we call tooth. So as I glue these in with CA glue, that they will stick tightly. So I'm going to get a piece of very coarse sandpaper, and what I'm going to do here is simply go all the way around this tube, both ends, cutting through the patina of the brass, but also taking some pretty small grooves in here. So this needs to be a coarse grit. And that's all it takes But those now are ready to be glued in here. So in order not to make a mess on my lathe, now this particular kit, these two are exactly the same length. They're exactly the same diameter. And so if I get them mixed up, it doesn't matter. Some kits, it does matter. I'm going to use CA glue. I use kind of a medium thick. And I'm going to apply it to the tube. About 2/3 of the way up, so I got finger holding room. And insert it from the marked section. The other from the marked end. Now that glue has to dry. And as soon as it's dry, you can see I have glue left over. And the brass tube doesn't quite reach the other end. So we've got a little trimming to do. But I've got to wait for a minute or two for this glue to totally harden. And then we'll be back. Okay, the glue's dry. We're ready to do the next step, which is to square the end of the blank off to the brass tube on this end. And since I cut the blank slightly long, to bring it down to the end of the brass tube and square it off on this end. There's a lot of ways to do that. I'm going to do it here on the lathe again. I'm going to set it back in the jaws. Well, I have to open the chuck up a little bit. Set it in here loosely. And in the Jacobs chuck on this end, I'm going to use a barrel trimmer. This is carbide cutters that are exactly 90 degrees to the shaft, which will fit perfectly inside of this. So I'm going to load that into here, lock it down, come up, and I want it to be square to the brass tube. So what I'm going to do is to slide it onto here loosely, set that into the chuck now, and at the same drilling speed. I'm going to lock the tailstock down. And that's cutting it square to the end of that tube. And what I want to know, oh, that wasn't what I wanted. I want to know that the brass is flush to the wood, and I can see shiny brass, which means I have squared that end off. Next time I'll tighten it more into the chuck. Here I have to take some wood away. And I'll be a little tighter in the chuck this time. Lock off the tailstock. We got about 1/8 of an inch of wood to go. And if I back it off, I can look to see if I can see the brass tube yet, and I cannot. Yep, there it is. And here is one blank ready. This is square to the wood is square to the brass. Here I've turned away the excess wood and it's squared up to the brass. And I'm going to do it all over again on the other piece. Both pieces are square, shiny brass is showing, and I now can begin to turn the pen. So there are 3 stages in pen turning. One is just preparing the blanks that we've done. Second stage is actually putting on the lathe and turning the pen into the shape you want. And the third stage is simply putting all the components together. So you can break this down into a lot of short steps, easily done in the evening in a few minutes, and come back the next evening and do some more. So now I'm going to prepare to turn the pen, and we use a mandrel. There's a lot of different ways. There are, where are they? There's mandrels with a rod that fit right into the headstock like this one. Here's another one that's adjustable in length. Those are ways of doing it that are very common. I'm going to stay right with what I have here and simply take a mandrel rod, put it into the same chuck jaws, just my way. And now, because I have to establish dimensions, remember this pen, it has to fit these components. I have to establish those dimensions. And the way I do that is with a series of bushings that are unique for this kit. So this one goes on first. This is going to be the tip of the pen, this direction. And since I need to make these the right dimension, there's a bushing that goes here. And then the other piece goes on. I'm matching these marks. If I had a really fancy piece of wood, I want that grain to look nice, and I want to keep going the same direction, so doing that. And then this goes on. Now I need to hold this end. Well, I'll get rid of the Jacobs chuck. And I'm going to use a device like this. It slides over the mandrel, and the pressure now is on the bushings in the wood, and there's virtually no pressure on the rod itself. Pressure on the rod can easily cause this to deform, bend, and once it's bent, you'll never get it back in shape again. There's several of those on the market. This one's fairly inexpensive from a lot of the dealers. This is a more expensive version. They're precisely the same thing, and before these came on the market, I'd made my own, so I had my own version. These have a Morse taper. They go into a tailstock like that. And my pressure now is on the bushings and on the wood, and that metal rod in the center, the mandrel, has virtually no pressure on it at all. So now I can turn easily. I'll line these marks up just for fun. It's not necessary. It's tight. It's tight. I've locked the tailstock down. Don't need that. I'll put it away. And now I'll bring up my tool rest. And you can see why I preferred a short tool rest here. It just fits the length of the project I want to work with. Now, what tool, for me, the tool of preference for pen turning is my skew chisel. And before I get started, a few strokes on the hone just to make sure that edge is as sharp as I can get it. And because this is a fairly small diameter piece of wood, roughing it out and shaping it down to these dimensions established by these bushings is going to be really easy to do with the skew chisel. Okay, now the difference here is I have to run the speed up pretty high. This is a small diameter, and we want surface speed past the cutting edge to be fairly high so we have a clean cut. That means for smaller pieces we have to run higher RPMs. In this case, I'd like to get up to maybe 1800 to 2000. I'm at 2000 RPM. Nice having a digital display here to tell me that. So now what I'm going to do basically is the standard planing cut that we covered in the skew chisel part 1 many lessons ago. So this is the planing cut to get rid of the corners and get this thing nice and square. Remember, I'm not going to come onto the end. I'm going to work towards the end so I don't get major catches. Safety glasses on. Okay, it slipped a little bit, which means I need a little bit more pressure on the tailstock to hold that tight. So I just tighten it up a little bit more. doing is getting it round. Still slipped a little bit, didn't it? No more pressure. I'm just doing a standard planing cut. Each cut is exactly like the last one. In fact, I'm hardly moving my tool position at all. So now I have a nice round blank. And my next activity would be take my tool and bring this end down to that diameter established by the bushing. These two down to this one, similar over here. So what I'm going to do is bring my tool rest in a little tighter. I thought I was a little high on my tool, so I'm going to drop it a little bit. And for the next couple of minutes, I'm simply going to shape this pen into something that's pleasing to me. A little bulge down here, a little bulge up here. The kit I'm going to put together has a ball on the end of the clip, which allows me to put a little bit of curvature underneath here. If this is a flat clip, I'd have to be maybe a little flatter. So I look at my kit and make some judgments. So now I'm just going to turn myself a pen. Stop for a second, get out of the fast forward for a minute. As I get closer to the bushings that I'm using, I'm beginning to roll my body and the tool a little bit like this to create that curve coming down here. I'm not going to go all the way to the middle bushing. I'm going to stop about a fingernail's thickness shy. The reason is I have to sand, and sanding is going to take off a little bit more wood. So I want to stop when I can still catch my fingernail on that piece of wood. I'm not there yet on any of these locations, but I'm getting close enough now that I'm going to turn with a little bit more care, and I'm going to take curving cuts, which you're going to see my body and the tool going sort of like this. Back to work. Turning's roughly done. Do a little sanding now and get this ready to go. So tool rest out, and first thing I'm going to do is take a piece of fairly coarse sandpaper and just sort of blend out any of my tool marks that I might have put in there. Not taking too much off. I can do a little shaping here too if I wanted to. One thing I'm trying to do is to avoid getting the sandpaper onto the metal bushing. If this touches that, it'll sand that down also. And if I sand on the metal and then come back towards the wood, sometimes you find a little light gray color on these ends, and that's metal fibers that have been carried by the sandpaper back up into the wood. So always sand as you get near the bushings, toward the bushing, and recognize that you need to move your paper almost every time. So that's really, really rough. It's now time to get into some more sophisticated sanding. So I'm going to go to a number of different grits, and I brought a selection along. I think a good place to start is maybe for me about 180. Sometimes I'm lucky enough I can start at 220, so here's a piece of 180. And I'm going to sand, keeping the paper moving constantly. Now, here's the trick in sanding, especially for pens, because it's so easy to see faults and failures. Once I finish sanding that way with the lathe running, I'm going to turn the lathe off, and I'm going to sand this direction with the lathe off along the grain. That takes away the swirly marks that I may have put in there in the first step. Every grit this way. This takes a few seconds. But now, those circular marks that I put on in the first portion of this are gone. 180. Let's see if we can find a 220 in this bag. I'll bet you there's one in here someplace. There we go. Different brand, but it's marked 220, so it's going to work. Same technique. Now I can check with my fingernails. This one is almost perfect. This is a little proud. This is a little proud. That one's just about right too. So I know that here and here I need to do just a little bit more sanding as I go. So 220, I'm going to do a little bit more work right down here just for a second. And here. And now lathe off, sanding with the grain. .220. Now I could go up to other grits, but one of the things I do to finish off with is go to 4/0 steel wool. The thing about steel wool, always be cautious of loose ends. If they get over here, they'll be grabbed by that chuck, that be pulled right out of your hands. One, never wrap it around your finger. Number two, be cautious of the loose ends. Now I have a pretty smooth piece of wood here. It's ready to get a finish. There's a lot of different finishes we could use, and one most frequently used is a friction polish. And let me show you how that's done. I'm going to go get my materials out, and I'll be right back, and we'll do a little friction polish finish on this one. Okay, I went to the shop, picked up what I wanted, what's called friction polish, used by a lot of pen turners. And here's a bottle of friction polish. And I want you to see it before I shake it up. This is shellac. This is carnauba wax. And in suspension, they go on really nice, but sitting on the shelf, they separate like this. And so friction polishes need a good agitation before you go to work with them. And now you probably can't see it, but there's a slurry of wax and shellac together. And the way we do this, I love these blue shop towels. They're paper towels, but they're softer than the standard kitchen paper towels. I roll it up into a small piece like this. The problem with friction polish is putting on too much. If you put on too much, it gets streaky and it becomes hard to dry. So at the same turning speed, a little drop on my paper towel, a quick rub. Now, I need to set that. I need the wax to get hot enough that it melts and runs. So I'm going to a clean paper towel at the same RPM, and I'm going to apply pressure. I'm leaning into this thing, and my finger is getting warm. That's what I want. And I don't know if you can see it, but the wood is getting shiny. That's one coat. And you can see a little wax came off in the paper towel. So let's do it again. Apply a little bit more. My paper towel. Neatly if I can. Light coat. Dry paper towel. I could have used the other end of the same one. Clean spot. I'm increasing the speed a little bit because it creates more friction. I get heat faster. And this is a quick way. And now we have a pen blank ready for assembly. It's a nice look. It looks great for presentation, but the problem with friction polishes, it doesn't last very well. With use, with your fingers, the salts and the oils that are coming out of your finger, this will eventually dull. And what will need to be done is buffed out or roughed up later on. So I'm going to take this off the lathe, clean up a little bit here, and then we're going to put the components together right here on the lathe. Cleaned up a little bit, brought back the components for my pen. I've left it on the mandrel. This was the tip. This was the top. And this other stuff goes in the middle. So I need to assemble that. I'm going to take it off of here and assemble the components one at a time. So let me set this stuff out of the camera shot and show you how I'm going to do it. I use the lathe for assembly. This goes in the headstock. This goes in the tailstock. And the first thing I'm going to do is to mount the tip. So I'm going to pull the bushing off, remove this one piece, only this one piece, and I know this is the tip. So it goes in like this. Bring the tailstock up nearby, lock it off. I find this gives me a great deal of control. There are many other ways to assemble them. I've aligned these pieces up, a little bit of pressure on the tailstock. That piece is in here. Let's finish assembling the mechanism. Next thing I need to do is to install the transmission. Brass end first. It goes in the other end of the tube, and that is where the pen mechanism works. I've got to put my glasses on so I can see that I have this perfectly aligned. So I've got to square it up here, and it's nice and straight. And I'm going to push it into the end of the brass, period. And I'm going to stop there. Because the kits tend to be a little bit varied in their dimensions, I'm going to put the blank in and turn it down and see whether it's in far enough or I need to push it in farther. And this looks really good. That's as far as it needs to go. Next piece that goes here is that little decorative ring. Just slides literally right over the shaft and pushes down and sets like that. So I'm going to set that part aside, and now I have to do the top. This is a clip end. That's why I left it on the mandrel so I don't get confused. Clip end. Clip is in two components. There's a clip and the piece that pushes through the clip. It goes here like this. I'll set it into here, bring my tailstock up close by, and press it into place. If you have a small defect in your wood of any kind, it's a great time to be able to move that clip around and put it on top of the defect. So tighten that down. And we have a standard 7mm pen. So that's the basics. That's all there is to pen turning. And now, if you go to fancier kits, there are a lot of variations. Instead of the pen tubes being the same length, they vary. Instead of these diameters of these holes being the same, they vary. Instead of all these being the same dimension, that can vary. I've shown you the basic 7mm kit. I'm going to show you what's called a Euro style, and the only reason I wanted to show you this one is I want to show you that there are lots of options and they get more complex. This is why we need the instruction sheet. This one, each of these dimensions on this kit, here, 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 and here, vary and are different. So the bushings for each of these locations are different. The lengths of the blanks are different. This one's short, this one's long. So when you get a kit, sometimes interswitching these components makes a big difference. That would not work. I need the small one for the tip, the larger one for the top. So I'm going to turn this kit, and then I am going to do that off camera, but then I'm going to come back and show you another way of finishing that I think is much more rigorous, much more lasting, and I find almost as fast to do. So I'm going to turn this kit, and I'll be back to show you a finishing technique. Okay, I've turned the pen, and I'm going to talk to you about a CA finish. I've set aside 400 320 grit sandpaper in case I need them. My technique is to use thin CA glue and boiled linseed oil as a lubricant. And I'm going to apply it with that blue shop towel that I like so much. I'm going to roll it up. Now, CA glue, if you get it on your fingers, you got to be really cautious because the protein in your fingers will cause your fingers to stick together, and you need to be very cautious to avoid that. So what I'm going to do, I'm taking one of these part bags that the kit came in, I'm using like a finger cot. That's what's going to protect my finger from getting all that CA glue on it. I'm going to do it like this. I've set the lathe speed at 500 RPM. I've set it down slow because I want to have it about where most mini lathes bottom setting is. And the CA is going to be applied, it's thin CA glue. I want it small, thin layers that spread and level easily. So a little bit of the boiled linseed oil, just enough to moisten the towel, and that's going to be a lubricant. Slightly activates a little bit. Now, this is going to be underneath, the CA is going to be on top. I'm at 500 RPM. Quick pass. Now, rub. And I'm going to keep rubbing until that CA glue sets. And that's going to take 10, 15 seconds at the most if the glue is not super fresh. You can already see what the glisten looks like. Second coat. Yeah, and I can feel it setting because I can feel my finger through the paper towel getting warm. Third coat. And the rubbing keeps it level. Now after the third coat, I want to do a little sanding just in case there's anything I need to take care of. So I'm going to set this down. I'm going to be sure the glue is totally dry. Oh, it's getting really hot now, so I know that it's setting. You also smell an odor coming off, and that odor is actually cyanide gas, part of the catalyzing process, converting this from a liquid into a pure plastic material. So what I'm going to end up with is a pen that is literally plasticized on the outside. It's going to resist fingerprints, it's going to resist all sorts of abrasion. Now with the lathe off, I can still see some grain in the wood showing through. I'm going to be sure this glue is really dry, and it is. And I'm going to sand at this point and then come back and do a few more coats. So I want to be sure it's really dry. I tend to wait several minutes just to be sure that there's no tackiness at all left. And you can see some of the glisten is beginning to go away a little bit, and that's part of the drying process. So I'm going to take my 400 light sanding. All I'm doing is making sure everything is nice and level. Now I like to look at the sandpaper, and I can see white on the sandpaper, which means that I am sanding the CA. If it came off brown, that means I'm already down to the wood and I don't have very many layers on here. This is coming off white, it means I'm sanding the plastic layer. Again, like normal, in the direction of the grain. And back to the same thing again. Now this part's hardened already, that's like a rock. Start all over again. A little boiled linseed oil for lubricant. Still 500 RPM. This coat's going to set very fast because of the work we've already done on it. So, quick coat. Rub, rub, rub. That's 4. And I'll put another coat on. And basically, I'm going to let this dry. I'm going to rub it with a little 4/0 steel wool, and then I'm going to go buff it. So if you find that your pen sticks to your bushings a little bit, it's good to wax these before you start the turning. That allows the CA not to stick to the metal and the parts come apart much more easily. So, looking pretty doggone good. What I'm going to do is make sure this is good and dry. I'm going to steel wool, and I'm going to go back to my buffing system and buff it and bring it right back to you to let you see what the final results look like. Back in a couple of minutes. Finished turning it, finished the finish, buffed it. I started off with a little 4/0 steel wool. I went to my Beal buffing system. I went through the first 2 buffs, and this is what we end up with. I don't know how much you can see of the shine, but to me that pen's ready for assembly. And with the CA finish, that's going to resist wear much, much better. So, same process as before, put the components together, and we have a pen. I wanted to show pen turning, specifically because for some people, this is a real hobby. There's so many places you can go, so many different kinds of kits, so many things you can do to the blanks themselves to make them interesting. Just thought I'd show you some options here, just give you a sense of places that you can go. These pens here, very unique looking. That's that same 7mm kit put together a little differently. Same kit. Here's the Euro style. This is a 7mm that's been done with an acrylic material that I cast. Designs can be put into it. There's a lot of options. I actually even go to my 3D printer and print some pens. This hasn't been turned at all. That's just the way it came off the printer. So there's a lot of options. It's a hobby, it's fun, and for many people, they spend a lot of time. I had a man one time brought me a huge kit of pens, all the same. Each one a different species of wood. It was his wood collection, done in a pen style. Interesting. So stay tuned. We'll be back with another project in a couple weeks and see what we're going to do next. Thanks for watching.